through the gap beneath the warped oak door. Ancient brass dust, so deep into the pine floorboards that the wood had become a different material entirely. And underneath all of it, something almost sweet, wood feeds so long in its own darkness that it had begun breaking down from within. Abandonment has no smell. Whatever was in this building had been keeping itself alive. Miriam Voss pressed her palm flat against the door and felt the iron handle beneath her fingers. The iron climbed through her wrist before she'd had time to prepare for it, deep, vaulted, the chill of a room that had long ago given up pretending otherwise. She was 18 years old. She had $6.12 in a bank account she'd checked had seemed mornings. Because the first reading had seemed impossible. The notification had come through on a phone with 4 days of paid service remaining. $6.12. She'd stood at the corner of Purchase Street reading it, while November rain ran down the back of her collar, then put the phone in her pocket and kept walking to the attorney's office because there was nothing else to do. Outside, New Bedford fog was settling in from the harbor, the heavy, deliberate kind, November fog that doesn't drift but descends. The cobblestones of Cannon Street ran dark and wet. A buoy bell rang once, somewhere out past the channel, and went quiet. Her palm was still on the door from somewhere inside, deep inside, past whatever was rotting and whatever had stopped. A pendulum swung. One slow, deliberate thud from within the layered dark, then silence. She had grown up around mechanisms, mainsprings that held tension across decades, escapement wheels cycling through movements that, if you watched them long enough, seemed almost deliberate. She understood things that ran in the dark without being watched. Her brothers never had, and they had never forgiven her for it. She pushed the door open. The darkness inside had texture, built from years of closed curtains and cobwebs that sensed enough old architecture of their own. A long glass display case ran the left wall. She moved toward it, brushing webs aside with her forearm, her fingers already dark with gear oil from the brass winding key in her hand. The only thing her grandfather's will had given her. Small, heavy, an engraving she hadn't fully read yet. 2 letters she was sure of, a third she wasn't. Across town at this exact moment, Aldrich Voss was executing a signature on a waterfront condominium conversion worth $9,400,000. His brother Court was on his 3rd single malt in the lobby bar of the hotel, where they'd been staying since flying in from Boston. Host suite at $412 per night. Charge to the estate had $6, a brass key, and a dead grandfather's watch shop. The pendulum swung once more in the dark, and she went in to find out. 8 days earlier, in the offices of Greer and Halloran on Purchase Street, the room smelled of old paper and the dry heat of a cast-iron radiator working too hard. Attorney Caulfield, thin, in a cashmere sport coat somewhere between grey and blue, had arranged all 3 of them across a mahogany table, Aldrich in his Brioni suit, Rolex face-up on the table like a credential. Court beside him in an open collar and a blazer that cost considerably more than anything Miriam owned. She sat alone on her side in a wool sweater with a fraying left cuff, hands in her lap, face arranged into something neutral. Caulfield read the assets in order. The family home on County Street, to Aldrich and Court jointly, valued at $863,000. The investment portfolio split equally between them, $1,241,000. The vehicle, the furniture, the accounts, then the shop. Voss Horological Works, Cannon Street, established 1891, described in the estate document as a structure in deteriorated condition, commercial zoning, property taxes in arrears by $12,487.90. Left entirely to Miriam Elaine Voss. Aldrich pressed 2 fingers to his temple like the whole reading had given him a headache. Dad always had a sense of humor. He wasn't speaking to Miriam. He hadn't looked at her since they'd sat down. "What's the building worth?" Court asked. Structurally, the last formal assessment was 1989. So nothing. Court's gaze moved to Miriam then. The kind of look you give a problem you've already decided isn't worth solving. Structurally compromised, condemned for all practical purposes. Back taxes attached. A pause. "Congratulations, Miriam. You can have the ruin." Caulfield cleared his throat before either brother could stand. He had, he said, twice suggested a personal walkthrough of the Cannon Street property during estate administration, standard procedure for any commercial transfer. The first time, Aldrich had declined without explanation. The second time, Court had been more direct, calling the suggestion pointless and describing the shop as a decaying, filthy waste of time. They had released instead on a contractor's remote assessment, a demolition cost estimate that returned a negative net value. Neither of them had set foot inside the building. They had made clear they had no intention of doing so. They left without looking back at her. Caulfield placed the brass key in Miriam's hand. Dense, warm from his pocket, ornate bow at one end, the barrel longer than standard. Under the fluorescent light, she could read the engraving properly for the first time. 3 letters, VHW, Voss Horological Works. Below them, a date, 1893. A key made in 1893 was not a door key. It was a winding key, built for a specific movement. A grandfather who placed it in a legal estate document had done so with an intention that had nothing to do with sentiment. She put it in her sweater pocket, folded her hands, and sat until the room was empty. She walked 4/10 of a mile in the rain with everything she owned in one bag over her shoulder. Cannon Street sat below the hill from the attorney's office, angled down toward the waterfront. She'd mapped it the night before on her phone. A habit. The kind of thing she did automatically. The kind of thing that had made her brothers roll their eyes at her since she was small. At the corner of William Street, she stopped to check the handwritten note Caulfield had given her. The note said the entrance key was on file at the clerk's office, but that the door had been left unlatched since the property tax lapse in 2020. She didn't need a key. The building was worse than she'd expected. Federal-style brick, 19th century construction, a recessed entrance with a transom boarded from inside. The carved wood sign above the door, Voss Horological Works, had been gilded once and was now the color of dried clay. Both upper windows had cracked along diagonal lines that meant the foundation had moved, sometime in the last 20 years, and no one had come back to address it. She counted to 47 standing on the wet cobblestones. A watchmaker's habit, she thought in intervals. Grief hit her somewhere to not fear of the building. Grief for the grandfather she'd barely been allowed to know, but the version of this place buried underneath its own decay, for the straight line between that version and this one that her brothers had bent into something unrecognizable. Then the fog shifted. A gust, off the harbor, salt heavy and cold enough to feel like a physical thing, and inside it, unmistakably, the smell of machine oil from inside a sealed building. From a structure closed for 3 years, fresher at present, as though something in there had been running recently. She pushed the door and stepped into the dark. The cold inside was a different order of cold, still pressured the cold of a sealed place that had stopped exchanging air with the world. Her flashlight found the floor, pine boards, warped but solid. She moved through the front room, past the counter, past the wall of stopped clocks with their hands frozen at different hours. The pendulum small was total and the petal of oil was stronger. The pendulum swung. Once. Then the shop went quiet again. She spent the first full day cataloging before she touched anything. 3 years under movement specialist in Providence had given her a method. Learn the architecture of a mechanisms before you open it. She went clock by clock with her flashlight, working in rows, making notes on a pad she'd found in the back office. She tallied what remained, what had been taken, what had run down versus what had been deliberately stopped. Most of the movements had simply exhausted themselves. Mainsprings unwound, pendulums still, the inevitable result of years without attention. The grandfather clock at the rear of the shop was different, a Vienna regulator case in black walnut, 7 feet and 2 inches tall. Its pendulum rod had been unhooked from the crutch and laid carefully against the back of the case. The drive weights had been coiled and tied off. Clocks run down when they're abandoned. This one had been put to rest, carefully, deliberately, by someone who understood the difference. She stood before it and turned the winding key over in her fingers. The case had a barrel lock below the waist door. When she fitted the key to it, the barrel took the teeth on the first try. Not the grinding resistance of a wrong key in a tight lock, but the clean, immediate engagement of a mechanism meeting its match. She turned it, and the waist door swung open without a sound. On hinges maintained well enough, that 3 years of disuse hadn't stiffened them. She knelt on the floor and aimed the flashlight into the weight compartment. The wooden floor of the compartment was wrong. The grain ran against the grain of the surrounding case walls, a false panel. 3 brass screws sunk flush at the conduits walls and it fit them out with a small flathead from her bag. The first 2 came easily. The third had seized, and she had to work it back and forth for several minutes, the heel of her palm going sore against the handle. Before it gave, the panel lifted free, a cavity below, 22 inches deep, 16 inches wide, lined in oilcloth folded with the care of someone who intended it to last. The cloth was cold and slightly stiff against her fingers. She peeled it back, gold sovereign coins in paper rolls, each one labeled in unfamiliar handwriting. Currency notes from the 1890s, flat and dry. Beneath them, a document sealed in wax canvas, the wax cracked with age, stamped with 3 initials, VHW, and beside it, a sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front unmistakable from a birthday card she'd received when she was 9, from a single letter that had arrived during the worst year of her parents' divorce. Her grandfather had addressed it to her by name. She sat back on the floorboards and held it in her lap for a while before she opened it. 2 pages, the handwriting slightly unsteady toward the end. He had purchased the coins over 37 years. He wrote, against the day he knew was coming, Baked would decide that money was the whole point. The waxed document was the original 1803 deed to the property, surveyed by Josiah Crane of Bristol County. Field notes. Enclosed. The deed's boundaries, he wrote, had never been legally superseded. She should read Chris' notes carefully before she let anyone tell her what this building was or wasn't worth. The last line read, "The shop was always yours. I only needed time to make that true." She folded the letter along its original creases and slipped it back into the envelope. Outside, gravel shifting under tires. A bar of headlight swept across the boards on the transom window. She put the envelope inside her jacket and waited. The man who came through the door was not one of her brothers. He was compact and suited, carrying a leather folder, and he introduced himself as Sever without offering a handshake. The Cannon Street property, he explained, had been placed into a corporate seizure filing under a 1978 municipal easement ordinance. The ordinance established a commercial corridor along this block, a portion of this building's northeast wall, per the 1978 survey, fell inside that corridor. Voss Capital had absorbed the entity that originally held the corridor rights. The filing had been accepted by the county clerk. He set the documents on the display case. Miriam picked them up. The VAT ran 23 pages and she read all of them, slowly, while Sever stood in the flashlight's peripheral glow with the patience of someone who has already decided how this ends. 72 hours to vacate, he said. After that point, the structure and all contents within it are subject to asset transfer under the seizure order. She turned to the appendix. Survey reference B-1978-14. Northeast baseline, Cannon Street Commercial Corridor. She'd come across that designation 2 days earlier at the public library, running a routine property records search purely out of habit. And the waxed document now inside her jacket referenced that same northeast baseline, drawn by Josiah Crane 85 years before the 1978 survey existed. She hadn't finished reading Crane's field notes yet, but she'd seen the coordinate block at the top of the first page. "I'll need to review this with counsel," she said. "That is entirely your right." Sever picked up his folder. 72 hours. After his car left, she sat down on the floor beside the grandfather clock, with Crane's field notes across her knees, and read until the flashlight battery started to dim. The emergency properties dispute hearing was held 4 days later in a ground floor chamber of the Bristol County Courthouse on William Street. Aldrich came in his Briones, suit. Court came in the blazer. Attorney Sever set his briefcase on the petitioner's table and opened it without looking down. Miriam came in with a watchmaker's loop, a measuring tape, and 2 documents in a manila envelope. Sever laid out the 1978 survey first. Baseline coordinates, easement corridor dimensions, chain of title from the original corridor holder through to Voss Capital. He walked the referee through the ordnance language and showed where the northeast wall of Voss Horological Works, per the survey's recorded baseline, fell inside the corridor by a margin sufficient to trigger the seizure provision. The referee turned to Miriam and said, "Response." She placed the 1893 deed on the table and Josiah Crane's field notes beside it. She didn't use notes of her own. The 1978 survey, she explained, had established its baseline from a reference point at the northeast corner of a freight depot demolished in 1961. The surveyor had worked from the recorded dimensions of that demolished structure. Those recorded dimensions contained a transcription error. The northeast baseline coordinate had been entered as 41 degrees, 37 minutes, and 22 seconds north. The original 1911 depot survey, she placed that document on the table as well, gave the coordinate as 41 degrees, 37 minutes, and 22.4 seconds north. At this latitude, that fraction of a degree translates to 14 feet and 3 inches on the ground. Under Crane's 1893 survey, documented, filed with Bristol County, never superseded by any subsequent legal instrument, the northeast wall of Voss Horological Works sat 14 feet and 3 inches outside the easement corridor. The ordinance did not apply. The seizure filing had no legal basis. The referee asked to examine Crane's field notes. She handed them over. Aldrich had gone very still across the table. Sever requested a recess. 15 minutes were granted. Miriam kept her hands flat on the table and watched. The conference between Sever and the brothers had grown clipped. Aldrich's voice staying low, but his face doing something it rarely did in professional settings, something uncontrolled. Court had one hand pressed against his jaw and was staring at the floor. They had staked an entire seizure claim on a survey that had been accepted without scrutiny for 46 years because, in 46 years, no one with a practiced eye for precision had ever actually checked it. The one person in the Voss family, whose entire training was built around that kind of checking, who measured tolerances in fractions of a millimeter as a matter of handed habity, was the person they had handed the property to and never bothered to follow inside. What they had refused to enter out of aristocratic blindness and elitist disgust was exactly the physical sanctuary that had now legally destroyed them. Sever withdrew the filing when the hearing reconvened. From across the table, Aldrich's voice was flat in a way it hadn't been before. The energy had gone out of it entirely. "Congratulations, Miriam. I already do," she said. She sent. Knock. She picked up her envelope and walked out into the November light. A title challenge is public record. Other people read public records. The 1978 survey had been used as capital property acquisitions across Bristol and Spot Part, Plymouth counties. Within 4 months of the Cannon Street hearing, 3 adjacent landowners had filed independent challenges after their attorneys pulled the referee's notes. By spring, the State Attorney General's office had opened an inquiry, not into the survey error itself, but into whether anyone at Voss Capital had known about it, before using the survey to file seizure claims. The inquiry produced documentation of a different order of magnitude than a court took a plea arrangement. 22 months, federal minimum security. Aldrich contested through 3 levels of appeal, lost all 3, surrendered his real estate license, and declared personal bankruptcy following the dissolution of Voss Capital Holdings. The court-administered asset sale took care of the rest. The cashmere sport coat collection went with everything else. Miriam used the proceeds from the gold sovereign coins, assessed at $319,000, to pay off the tax arrears and fund a full structural restoration of the shop. She kept every clock. She restored each movement herself, working through 14 months of early mornings before opening and late evenings after closing, until there wasn't a stopped hand left in the building. She hired 2 apprentices from the local technical college. She renamed the business Crane and Voss Horological for the surveyor who had recorded his measurements accurately in 1893, and in doing so had given her grandfather somewhere safe to put the things that mattered. The shop opened on a March morning when the harbour fog had lifted early, and the light came in low and gold across the Cannon Street cobblestones. Miriam stood behind the counter in her work apron, loop on a cord at her neck, hands clean for the first time in months. She was 18 years old. She had come to this building with $6.12 and a key she hadn't understood yet. The first customer who came through the door asked what the oldest clock in the shop was worth. She thought about that for a moment before answering. The value of a thing built to keep time, she told him, isn't what it cost to make. It isn't even what it survived. It's whether it's still running when everything around it has stopped.